God, I can't believe I'm finally telling the story. I'm sorry. I'm sorry if I sound all messed up. I'm just remembering it all again. I was an I was an intern at Nickelodeon Studios back in 2005. It was me and two other editors. We were in the editing room along with lead animators and sound editors for a final cut of an episode. We received the copy that was supposed to be Fear of the Krabby Patty and gathered around the screen to watch. Now, given that it isn't the final yet, animators often put up a mock title card as a sort of inside joke for all of us, with phony, also oftentimes lewd titles such as How Sex Doesn't Work, instead of Rockabye Bevail, when SpongeBob and Patrick adopt a sea scallop. Nothing particularly funny, but work-related chuckles. So when we saw the title card, Squidward's Suicide, we didn't think of it more than a morbid joke. One of the interns had a small throat laugh at it. The happy-go-lucky music played as normal, and the story began with Squidward practicing his clarinet, hitting a few sour notes like normal. We hear SpongeBob laughing outside, and Squidward stops yelling at him to keep it down as he has a concert that night and needs to practice. SpongeBob says okay, and he goes to see Sandy with Patrick. The bubble splash screen comes up, and we see the ending of Squidward's concert. This is where things begin to seem off. While playing, a few frames repeat themselves, but the sound the sound was synced up with the animation, so yes, that's not common. But the sound didn't play when he stops playing. The sound finishes as if it skipped, never happened. There's a slight murmuring in the crowd before they begin hearing malice in it. Squidward's in full frame, and looks visibly afraid. Shot goes to the crowd. The odd thing was that everyone had hyper-realistic eyes. Very detailed. Clearly not shots of real people's eyes, but something a bit more real than CGI. The pupils were red and some of us looked at each other, obviously confused. But since we weren't the writers, we don't question the appeal to children yet. The shot goes to Squidward sitting on the edge of his bed, looking forlorn. The view's out of the porthole window of a night sky, so it isn't very long after the concert. The unsettling part is, at this point, there's no sound. Literally no sound at all. Not even feedback from the speakers in the room. The speakers were turned off, though their status showed them as working perfectly. He sat there blinking in the silence for about 30 seconds. Then he started to sob. So he sobbed softly. He put his tentacles over his eyes and cried quietly for a full minute more. All while the sound in the background was very slowly growing from nothing to barely audible. It sounded like a slight breeze through a forest. The screen slowly begins to zoom in on his face. By slow, I mean it's only noticeable if you look at shots 10 seconds apart side by side. His sobbing gets louder and more full of hurt and anger. The screen then twitches a bit and twists on itself for a split second, then back to normal. The wind through the trees, the sound gets slowly louder and more severe as the storm's brewing somewhere. The eerie part is that the sound, Squidward's sobbing, sounded real. As if the sound wasn't coming from the speakers, but as if the speakers were holes and the sound was coming through the other side. As good as the studio likes to have their sound, they don't purchase the equipment that would be good to produce sound of that quality. Something sounded like laughing. It came at odd intervals and never lasted more than a second, so you had a hard time pinning it. We watched this show twice, so pardon me if things sound too specific, but I've had a hard time thinking about them. After 30 seconds of this screen was blurred and twitched violently, something flashed over the screen as if a single frame was replaced. The lead animation editor paused and rewound the frame by frame. What we saw was horrible. It was a still photo of a dead child. He couldn't have been more than 6. His face was mangled and bloodied, one eye dangling over his face, popped out. He was naked down to his underwear. His stomach was crudely cut open and his intestines were laying beside him. He was laying on some pavement that was probably a road. This was the upsetting part. There was a shadow of the photographer. There was no crime tape, no evidence tags or markers, and then the angle is completely off. For a shot designed to be evidence, It would seem the photographer was the person responsible for the child's death. We, of course, were mortified, but pressed on, hoping that it was just a sick joke. The screen flipped back to Squidward sobbing louder than before. Half body and frame, there was now what appeared to be blood running down his face from his eyes. The blood was also done in hyper-realistic style, looking as if you could touch it and you could get blood on your fingers. The wind sounded now as if it was that gale blowing through the forest. There were even snapping noises of branches, the laughing, a deep baritone lasting that longer intervals, and coming more frequently. After 20 seconds, the screen again twisted and showed a single frame photo. The editor was reluctant to go back. We all were, but we knew what he had to do. This time the photo was what appeared to be a little girl. No older than the first child. She was laying on her stomach. Her bare nets in a pool of blood next to her. Her left eye was too popped out. She was naked except she was in her underwear. Her eternals were piled on top of her above another crude cut along her back. Again, the body was on the street and the photographer's shadow was still visible. Very similar size and shape to the first. I had to choke back to vomit, and one intern, the female one in the room, ran out. The show resumed. About 5 seconds after the second photo played, Squidward was silent, as did all the sound like it was when the scene started. He put his tentacles down, and his eyes were now done in hyper-realism, like others were in the beginning of the episode. They were bleeding, bloodshot, and pulsating. He just stared at the screen as if he was watching the viewer. After about 10 seconds, he started sobbing. This time not covering his eyes. The sound was piercing and loud. Most of us feared and dicing all of his sobbing, mixing in screams. Tears and blood were dripping down his face at a heavy rate. The wind sound came back, and so did the deep voice laughing. At this time, the still photo lasted for a good 5 frames. The animator was able to stop on the 4th and back up. This time the photo was a boy of the same age. This time the scene was different. The entrails were just being pulled out from his stomach wound by a large hand. The right eye popped and dangling, blood trickling down it. The animator proceeded. It was hard to believe. But the next one was different. We couldn't tell what. When we went next, he went back to the first and played them quicker. I lost it. I vomited on the floor, the animating and the sound editors gasping at the screen. The 5 frames were not as they were 5 different photos. They were played out as they were frames of a video we saw. We saw the hand slowly lift out the guts and saw the kid's eyes focus on it. We even saw the 2 frames where the kids were starting to blink. The lead sound editor told us to stop. He had to call the creator in to see this. Mr. Hillenberg arrived within 15 minutes. He was confused to why he was called down there. So the editor just continued the episode. Once the few frames were shown, all the screaming, all the sound again stopped. Squidward was just staring at the viewer. Full frame of face for about 3 seconds. The shot panned, and a deep voice said, "Do it." And we see in Squidward's hands a shotgun. He immediately puts the gun to his mouth and pulls the trigger. Realistic blood and brain matter splatters on the wall behind him in his bed. He flies back with force. The last 5 seconds of the episode show his body on the bed on his side. One eye dangling, and what's left of a head above the floor, blankly at it. Then the episode ends. Mr. Hillenberg was obviously angry. He demanded to know what the hell was going on. Most people left the room at this point, so it was just a handful of us to watch it again. Viewing the episode twice only served to imprint entirely in my mind and caused me horrible nightmares. I'm sorry, I stayed. The only theory that we could think of is the file was edited by someone in the chain from the drawing studio to here. The CTO was called to analyze when it happened. They analyzed the file, and they did show it was edited over by new material. However, the timestamp of it was a mere 24 seconds before we began viewing it. All the equipment involved was examined for the foreign software and hardware, as well as glitches, as the timestamp had glitched and showed the wrong time, but everything checked out fine. We don't know what happened to this day. Nobody does. There was an investigation due to the nature of the photos, but nothing came of it. No child scene was identified, and no clues were gathered from the data involved, nor physical clues in the photos. I never believed in unexplainable phenomena before, but now that I've had something happen that I can't prove anything beyond evidence, I think twice about things.